Why does reality help us with overcoming psychological suffering? Well, the simple answer is that reality is all we have. Our psychological functions, conventional reality, objective reality, all of those things are in a state of change, and we can't readily hold on to them because of that fact. However, reality is reality. That's all we have. There's nothing more than that. And for that reason, the better we understand reality, the better we understand the basis for all other aspects of our life, our functioning, and so on. When we think about reality, we often separate that from ourselves. We see ourselves as something separate and something that reality is within in some cases. However, it's quite the opposite, as I've mentioned before. We are within reality. So when we understand reality, that's the basis of our own being. This is a difficult thing to see because our psychological functions are particularly good at making us feel individual, like we are separate from the environment, separate from others. This is something that's commonly known as duality on the spiritual side, and a evolutionary function of language on the science side. It's very useful to think of ourselves as being separate or different because that harbors a sense of needing to survive. If we are separate from our environment, we want to live. If we want to live, we're going to protect ourselves. And by doing that, we're reinforcing this notion that we are a separate self that needs to live and needs to exist. Now, another way of looking at this is that what we are talking about in terms of the self is a culmination of components that are always in a state of change. In Buddhism, we call these the five aggregates, for example. In other spiritual traditions, you might see divisions for the mind and body. That's an easier way to think about it. Our mind and body are comprised of things that are not separate from our environment. The sooner we realize this, the sooner we see that everything we are comprised of is within this same underlying reality that we thought we were separate from. It's a little strange at first to think about, but once you realize it from a basis of insight as opposed to knowledge, it really clicks. It clicks because you get to a point where what you perceive goes well beyond self, other, body, environment. The dualities dissolve, and all of the experiences kind of mesh together within one type of awareness. Now, I would say that the awareness you are experiencing is also a psychological function, and the reason for that is because everything we can perceive or experience is a psychological function. How else could it be? Easy way to think about this is when you fall into a state of deep sleep, deep dreamless sleep. You could say your psychological functions are at a minimum there, kind of just go through a blank in terms of the contents and states of consciousness, and then things come back later on. Now that's important because it helps us to see what we experience, all of the different substrates, whether you think reality is constructed by the mind or independent of the mind. Everything we experience comes down to our own brains. And I'll have this on the live stream tomorrow in terms of talking about basic functions of the mind. The mind is comprised of various neuropsychological functions, as I'll talk about. And these neuropsychological functions all come together to help construct our very own reality. Now, this is a really cool field to study and talk about because you get to see firsthand, especially when you see patients, clinical cases, how the mind breaks down. And when the mind breaks down, you lose certain functions, things you've taken for granted, the ability to see, the ability to smell, seeing things as a coherent visual whole, kind of like the flow of a movie. Your perception of reality for Balint syndrome, for example, can break down into still images, kind of like a flip book going in slow motion. Just all sorts of functions you never thought could have went wrong do in neuropsychology. clinical psychology, psychiatry, all those fields come together. And when you see this firsthand, you really get to understand the limitations of the mind and how our psychological functions can come and go. The sooner you realize this, and the better you realize it, the better you understand that what you are has to be more fundamental than these psychological functions, because those functions were created from something more fundamental. And when you realize that, when you get to the bottom of that analysis, that is one of the key paths for awakening.